It is August 4th, and August 4th is the birthday of the nation's oldest seagoing service. On October 4th, 1790, at the suggestion of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, Congress approved the construction of 10 cutters to enforce the customs law. Those original 10 revenue cutters were the forebearers of what today we call the United States Coast Guard, 8 years before the permanent establishment of the United States Navy. But we don't know much about the service of those original 10 cutters because their records were lost when the British burned Washington, D.C. in 1814. And that seems to be completely fitting because the history of the Coast Guard often seems to be lost when compared to the other services. Like, for example, their nearly forgotten service in the Vietnam War, where they engaged in, among other things, the largest naval surface engagement of that war. It is history that deserves to be remembered. In February 1965, a U.S. Army lieutenant flying a medical evacuation helicopter noticed something strange along the coast of South Vietnam's Vung Ro Bay. The website Defense Media Network explains, as he banked over Vung Ro, he sensed something wrong with a tree-covered island below. When he flew closer, he discovered that the island was in fact a small ship, cleverly camouflaged with potted plants on its deck and superstructure. What he had seen was an approximately 130-foot boat of the type typically called a trawler, camouflaged with branches, and apparently unloading cargo perpendicular to the shore. The pilot radioed the sighting in, and A-1 Sky Raiders of the Republic of Vietnam Air Force attacked and capsized the vessel. Later that day, Republic of Vietnam troops, accompanied by a U.S. Navy advisor, landed and inspected the site. The website World History Project describes what they found. The Allies recovered from the 130-foot North Vietnamese ship and from shore sites 100 tons of Soviet and Chinese-made war material, including 3,500 to 4,000 rifles and submachine guns, 1 million rounds of small arms ammunition, 1,500 grenades, 2,000 mortar rounds, and 500 pounds of explosives. What became known as the Vung Ro Bay incident confirmed to military planners what some had long suspected. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces in South Vietnam were being supplied by sea. A 1975 report by the Center for Naval Analysis noted, North Vietnam had been organized to direct infiltration into South Vietnam since 1959. During that year, Viet Cong needs for out-of-country resupply in South Vietnam began to increase. Possible infiltration routes were from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Cambodia, and the sea. Seaborne infiltration was recognized as a possible means of resupply as early as 1961. Cargo that took 170 days overland to reach the VC-NVA in South Vietnam reached them in a few days by sea, with far less manpower expended. The confirmation was important in transforming the American role in Vietnam. The Defense Media Network continues. In addition, troops discovered numerous North Vietnamese charts and assorted military papers. Among them were documents revealing that members of the North Vietnamese Army's 338th Division were stationed in the region, and that the trawler had been constructed in Communist China, was Unit K-35 of the North Vietnamese Naval Transportation Group 125. The incident and other events helped transform the largely advisory American presence of Military Assistance and Advisory Group Vietnam to the active American Combat Force effort, Military Assistance Command Vietnam. One result was the creation of Operation Market Time. The spring 1998 edition of the Naval War College Review notes, on 16 March 1965, General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, approved a recommendation that U.S. and South Vietnamese naval forces operate together against coastal infiltration in Operation Market Time. Market Time's mission was to conduct surveillance and interdiction along the coast of South Vietnam, watching in particular for junks carrying weapons or supplies to the enemy. The website Vietnam War 50th writes, in March 1965, the Coastal Surveillance Force was established and began Operation Market Time, so named after the native boats using the waterways for fishing and marketing. This task force provided a single command to integrate sea, air, and land-based units and coordinate U.S. Navy and South Vietnamese naval units. But the website continues. While the U.S. Navy recognized the need for an effective security and surveillance system, it also knew that this would be a difficult task, with 1,200 miles of coastline to patrol and over 60,000 junks and sampans to control. The Center for Naval Analysis report explains the tactics used. Trawlers under the control of North Vietnam Naval Transportation Group 125 would either infiltrate directly over a beach or offload onto sampans and junks several miles offshore. These small craft would mingle with the thousands of similar boats used for fishing and transportation along the coast of South Vietnam. Defense Media Network describes the rationale for the operation. Prior to 1965, seaborne infiltration of material from North Vietnam was conducted at will by the communists. Intelligence estimates stated that during this period as much as 90% of all arms and supplies to the Viet Cong came from the sea. The task confronting the market-time forces was daunting in the extreme. Commerce and travel were conducted primarily over water on the thousands of miles of rivers, canals, and seacoast. On average, more than 60,000 sampans and junks alone traveled and fished the seas and waterways. Vietnam War 50th concludes. Soon, the Navy recognized the need for Coast Guard units to support this mission. The website of the United States Coast Guard recalls, on April 29, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed a memorandum for the President that required U.S. Coast Guard operating forces assist U.S. naval forces in preventing sea infiltration by the Communists into South Vietnam, and stated that the U.S. Coast Guard has operating forces which are well suited to the mission. The Naval War College Review notes that the Navy needed a craft suitable for this type of operation, one with high speed, a shallow draft, radar, and communication capabilities. And the Coast Guard offered unique skills given the task. Defense Media Network explains, because of their experience in customs inspections, Coast Guardsmen assigned to market time came with extensive practical knowledge in what was required. According to the Coast Guard website, the same day President Johnson signed his memorandum, the service announced formation of Coast Guard Squadron 1, or RON 1, in Vietnam. The squadron of 26 Point-class 82-foot patrol boats were the first U.S. shallow water units to patrol South Vietnam's coastal waters. The 82-foot, 10-inch Point-class vessels began construction in 1960, intending to replace the aging 95-foot Cape-class cutters. 17-foot 7 inches at the beam with a draft of 5 feet 11 inches. The hull was made of mild steel and the superstructure aluminum. Notably, given the climate of Vietnam, Point-class vessels were designed with air-conditioned interiors. Built with an eye towards manpower costs, they were deliberately designed to reduce the 15-person crew of the Cape-class vessels. In fact, the Point-class could operate with just 4 people, although the normal crew complement was 8 to allow boarding parties. In Vietnam service, 2 officers were added to the crew and accommodations made for 13. In addition, the vessels headed to Vietnam were upgraded with better communications equipment, deck lights, additional 50 caliber machine guns, and an 81mm trigger-fired mortar. The Naval War College Review explains, the machine guns provided a high rate of fire in case of an attack at close range, while the mortar was useful for destroying trawlers, firing illuminating star shells, and providing some shore bombardment. Initially 17 and eventually 26 Point-class cutters were assigned to the Navy and placed into Coast Guard Squadron 1, or RON 1. After modification, the cutters were placed on transports to the Philippines, while the crews underwent additional training, including small arms training, survival resistance evasion and escape training, and mountain warfare training. The squadron was commissioned May 27th and began patrols in July. The cutters were extremely busy. The Coast Guard website notes, in 5 years, RON 1 patrol boats would cruise over 4 million miles and expect over 280,000 vessels. The 82-footers, which were designed for search and rescue and law enforcement, were operational approximately 80% of their time in the war zone. The Naval War College Review explains, the Navy expected Coast Guard vessels to be on patrol 2/3 of the time, a higher demand on both the men and equipment than was required during peacetime in the United States. To meet this demand, the Coast Guard assigned 3 different crews to each craft, producing a constant rotation of sailors. The task was difficult, the Naval War College Review continues. For the men of the Coast Guard, each boarding involved tension. To avoid booby traps and surprise attacks, crew members of craft under inspection were required to open everything. Forced to remain on constant alert for anything suspicious, Coast Guard's personnel needed nonetheless to avoid being trigger-happy. Often they had to make split-second decisions, and they showed a great deal of restraint. In a complete search of a boat, Coast Guard personnel used a probe, a metal detector, and an angled mirror to help find enemy contraband, but the manual method was the most effective. This, however, meant moving large amounts of cargo or sifting by hand through holds full of fish, a physically exhausting and in no way glamorous job. To add to the stress of boarding, the crews of vessels that did not have enemy contraband were often openly hostile at having their boats ransacked. Coast Guard crews gave candy, fresh fruit, or sea rations to compensate for this inconvenience. The action could be hot, with several of the boats coming under small arms fire and machine gun fire. In August 1966, the cutter Point Welcome was mistaken for an enemy vessel and came under air attack. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade David Brostrom, and crewman Petty Officer Second Class Jerry Phillips were killed, and 8 members of the crew were wounded. With the communications equipment disabled, the commander killed, and executive officer seriously wounded, Chief Boatswain's Mate Richard Patterson took control of the vessel and grounded it to save the crew. For his actions, Patterson was awarded the Bronze Star with Combat V. In 1967, the Navy requested more support, this time asking for larger vessels to augment the radar picket ships that operated farther from shore. World War II-era Coast Guard high-endurance cutters of the Casco and Owasco class were much bigger than the Point-class cutters, and their 5-inch gun and two 40mm guns could provide gunfire support. These larger vessels could also provide medical assistance and resupply for the smaller vessels of Operation Market Time. 5 high-endurance cutters were assigned to Coast Guard Squadron 3, cutters of 4 different classes, rotated deployments. At the end of February 1968, Coast Guardsmen of both squadrons would take part in the largest naval battle of the war. According to the March 1968 monthly historical summary for the Commander of Naval Forces, Vietnam, a naval trawler was spotted by United States Navy SP-2H Neptune aircraft on February 28th. By morning, 3 more trawlers were discovered across the coast of South Vietnam. The Naval War College Review explains, 4 enemy trawlers attempted to infiltrate different points of the South Vietnamese coast simultaneously as part of the Tet Offensive, which had begun a month earlier. Trying to take large trawlers ashore in the face of Operation Market Time surveillance was a risky move. The Center for Naval Analysis report notes that the North Vietnamese attempt to land 4 trawlers simultaneously in February 1968, after the Tet Offensive, was the best example that the enemy was responding to a crisis by attempting to resupply his forces rapidly from the sea. The trawlers were not defenseless, mounting 57mm recoilless rifles and machine guns. 1 trawler was spotted by the high-endurance cutter Androscoggin and was intercepted by the Point-class cutters Point Welcome and Point Grey, as well as Navy swift boats and an Army helicopter gunship. The Defense Media Network notes, warning shots from the Androscoggin were answered by return fire from the trawler, and the nighttime engagement commenced. The Naval War College Review describes the fight. The U.S. forces waited until the enemy was 6 miles from the coast, when the Androscoggin challenged and illuminated the contact. The large trawler laid a screen of smoke and tried to evade interception. Supported by a helicopter gunship, the Androscoggin opened fire. When the trawler continued towards the coast, the other Coast Guard cutters and Navy swifts joined the attack. The Defense Media Network concludes, the trawler captain managed to beach his ship, and at 2:35, a huge fireball erupted from the enemy ship as it destroyed itself. Gerald McGill, the then 24-year-old commander of the Point Welcome, was quoted in a July 2020 edition of Military History Now. The trawler exploded, sending steel shrapnel into the air so thick that I later learned that Point Welcome's radar signal disappeared from the Androscoggin's radar screen, and they thought we were lost. At least 2 of the trawler's crew were killed in the explosion, and a 3rd was wounded. The 2 cutters were showered with debris from the explosions, and as a miracle we suffered no personnel casualties. The Point Welcome's forward windows were completely blown out. We eventually realized that the port and aft windows were actually blown out from the inside by shrapnel passing through the bridge. A 2nd trawler attempted to land off the Ca Mau Peninsula at the southmost tip of Vietnam. It was intercepted by the high-endurance cutter Winona and Point-class cutters Point Grace, Point Marin, and Point Hudson, along with Navy swift boats. The Naval War College Review reports that the Winona attempted to capture the enemy vessel intact. The trawler opened fire. A short battle followed. The Defense Media Network continues. The U.S. forces poured heavy gunfire into the trawler that soon burst into flames and then spectacularly exploded. A 3rd trawler was observed by the high-endurance cutter Minnetonka and retreated back to Chinese waters. A 4th trawler was destroyed by fire from South Vietnamese Navy vessels, Navy swift boats, and a C-47 gunship. The monthly historical reports notes that 5 81mm mortar rounds from the swift boat PCF-47 were direct hits, and the trawler exploded with a massive explosion due to the munitions on board. The trawlers were found to have carried a significant amount of military supplies. The Defense Media Network lists salvage from just 1 of the vessels. Ultimately, salvage operations conducted by the Allies succeeded in removing tons of supplies, including 7 82mm mortar tubes with 745 rounds of ammunition, 70 AK-47 automatic rifles, 39 RPG-2 rocket launchers with 81 cases of rocket rounds, and 28 cases of 7.62mm ammunition. The Naval War College Review noted that the destruction of 3 vessels and turning back of another illustrated both the capacity of and the necessity for the Navy and Coast Guard to work together. Navy planes and large ships made the initial contact with the enemy miles from shore, while smaller craft and helicopters attacked when the trawlers or small junks tried to reach the shore. Certainly the victory had a significant effect on attempts by the North to resupply by sea. The Center for Naval Analysis report noted that, after this unsuccessful 4-trawler effort in March 1968, no trawler infiltration attempt was detected by market time for a year and a half. The actions of March 1, 1968 demonstrated the overwhelming success of Operation Market Time, which by all accounts significantly impaired the North Vietnamese forces by forcing them to use the overland Ho Chi Minh Trail for supply. General Westmoreland said of the work of the Coast Guard, "Market Time forces have successfully blocked intrusions by sea, forcing the enemy to use the long, tortuous Ho Chi Minh Trail, thus affecting significantly his ability to properly sustain his forces in the South." In addition to Operation Market Time, Coast Guardsmen in Vietnam served as buoy tenders, operated long-range aids to navigation, or LORAN stations, served as merchant marine inspectors, and Coast Guard aviators flew both helicopters and aircraft as part of a Coast Guard Air Force aviator exchange program. Coast Guardsmen also fulfilled humanitarian roles, often providing medical assistance and food to boats they boarded. The Naval Wars College Review notes that each Coast Guard cutter adopted a South Vietnamese village. By doing this, the Coast Guard aimed to improve its men's morale by giving the victims of the war names and faces. They provided medical treatment, care packages, daily necessities, and personal gifts. As the review notes, historically, this has been a Coast Guard function to aid and support others in times of need. In 1970, the Point-class vessels of Ron 1 were turned over to the Navy of the Republic of Vietnam as part of the process of Vietnamization, even though Coast Guardsmen stayed in the country until 1972 to serve as advisors and assist in the operation of equipment that had been turned over. The U.S. Coast Guard contribution in Vietnam was important. It had a significant impact on the prosecution of the war. It was dangerous, grueling, thankless work. One Coast Guardsman described life on patrol as endless days of utter boredom, interrupted by sudden moments of terror and violence. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guide, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguide.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.